Her name is never given, not once in the entire Bible. We know her city, we know her husband's tribe, we know where she ran when she left him. But her name, the most basic proof that a person existed, the text erases completely. And that erasure is almost the least disturbing thing about her story. Because what happened to this nameless woman in a single night in a city of Israel at the hands of Israelite men would trigger a chain of events so catastrophic that it nearly wiped an entire tribe off the face of the earth. 65,000 soldiers would die, cities would burn to the ground, women would be massacred, then abducted, then given away. All of it set in motion by one body, cut into 12 pieces, sent across 12 tribes. Her name we will never know, but what her death did to a nation, that is what we are here to understand. But here's what's crucial to understand. The judges themselves are increasingly compromised. Othniel is relatively noble. Gideon is flawed but functional. Jephthah makes a rash vow that costs his daughter's life. Samson is a man of supernatural strength and catastrophically poor judgment who barely saves anyone but himself. The further we go into the book, the darker the figures become, the more corrupted the world. And then we arrive at Judges 19. The last 3 chapters of the book. There is no judge here. There is no heroic figure. There is no one to rescue anyone. The text itself announces what is happening with a phrase that appears 4 times in these final chapters, like a drumbeat. In those days, Israel had no king. And the very last verse of the entire book of Judges, the final sentence, reads, "In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit." That phrase is not just a historical description, it is an indictment. It is the book's thesis statement. And the story we are about to enter is its proof. This is what a world without moral order looks like. This is what happens when everyone does what is right in their own eyes. The Levite and the woman. Let's meet our characters. The man at the center of this story is a Levite, a member of the priestly tribe of Israel, the tribe set apart for religious service. He lives in the remote hill country of Ephraim, in the central highlands of Canaan. He has a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah, the region that lies roughly 40 miles to the south. Now, the institution of concubinage in ancient Israel was distinct from what we might imagine. A concubine was not simply a mistress in the modern sense. She was a secondary wife, legally recognized, socially positioned, protected by certain rights under ancient Near Eastern law. Her children could inherit. Her person could not simply be discarded without consequence. She occupied a liminal space in the social hierarchy, above a slave, below a primary wife, legally bound, personally vulnerable. We don't know her name. We know her father's city. We know her husband's tribe. We know where she went when she left. But her name, the most basic piece of human identity, the text withholds entirely. After 4 months, the Levite travels to Bethlehem to speak tenderly to her and bring her back. The Hebrew phrase used here, le daba al-liba, literally means to speak to her heart. It is the same phrase used in the book of Ruth, when Boaz comforts Ruth. It suggests gentleness, persuasion, emotional appeal. The Levite is not coming as a conqueror. He is coming as a man who wants his woman back. Her father welcomes him enthusiastically, remarkably enthusiastically. Over the course of 5 days, the father-in-law repeatedly urges the Levite to stay, to eat, to drink, to rest. Day after day, please stay one more night. Some scholars have suggested there is something suspicious in this excessive hospitality, that the father-in-law is stalling, perhaps not entirely eager to send his daughter back. But we're not told this explicitly. What we are told is that on the 5th day, the Levite insists on leaving. They depart late in the afternoon, too late. Traveling with them, the Levite, his concubine and his servant, along with 2 donkeys. They head north through the territory of Benjamin toward Ephraim. As evening approaches, they are passing the city of Jebus, the pre-Israelite name for Jerusalem. The servant suggests they stop there for the night. The Levite refuses. Jebus is not an Israelite city. It belongs to the Jebusites, one of the Canaanite peoples. Better, the Levite says, to press on to Gibeah or Ramah, cities of Benjamin, cities of Israel. Among their own people, they will be safe. He should have stopped at Jebus. They reach Gibeah as the sun sets. They sit in the town square, waiting. In the ancient world, sitting in the town square was the recognized signal for a traveler seeking hospitality. Every culture of the ancient Near East understood this. You were announcing your need. You were trusting the community to respond. No one comes. The city of Gibeah, a Benjaminite city, an Israelite city, leaves 3 travelers sitting in the public square as darkness falls. This is the first sign. In the ancient world, the failure of hospitality was not merely bad manners. It was a moral catastrophe. To leave a stranger in need was a breach of the deepest social covenant. The people of Gibeah do not respond. Finally, an old man comes in from the fields. He's not originally from Gibeah. He is from Ephraim, the same region as the Levite. He sees the travelers, asks where they are going and where they came from. And when he understands they have no one to take them in, he invites them urgently, almost desperately. Come home with me. I'll take care of everything. Just don't spend the night in the square. The desperation in that invitation is telling. The old man knows something about Gibeah. He knows why travelers should not remain in the public square after dark. The night that broke a nation. What happens next echoes one of the most disturbing passages in Genesis. The travelers are inside the old man's house. They are eating and drinking. And then the text delivers this. While they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him." This is almost word for word what happens in Genesis 19, when the men of Sodom surround Lot's house and demand that he bring out his angelic guests. The parallel is not accidental. The author of Judges 19 is drawing a direct comparison. What is happening in Gibeah, in an Israelite city, in the city of the tribe of Benjamin, is being equated to what happened in Sodom. The wicked men of Gibeah want to gang rape a traveling stranger. This is not desire, this is domination. This is the exercise of violent power over a vulnerable person, the ultimate expression of the breakdown of social order. The absence of law has become the presence of savagery. The old man goes out, he pleads with the mob, and here the text delivers a moment so morally repugnant that it has troubled readers for 3,000 years. No, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this outrageous thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But as for this man, don't do such an outrageous thing. The old man is offering the women to protect the man. We need to sit with this for a moment, because the text does not comment on this offer. It does not editorialize. It does not say, and the old man was wrong to say this. It simply records it and allows the horror to speak for itself. The old man's offer is a window into a world where the concept of female humanity has been so thoroughly eroded that 2 women can be offered as substitutes for violence against 1 man. And this is considered by the offering party to be a moral solution. The men of Gibeah don't accept the old man's offer, but then the Levite himself acts. The text says he took his concubine and sent her outside to them. He pushed her out the door. He pushed her out the door. The text gives us no dialogue here, no plea, no attempt to protect her, no wrestling with the decision. He took her and he sent her outside, and the men of Gibeah raped her and abused her throughout the night, and at dawn they let her go. She crawled back to the door of the house. The text says her hands were on the threshold. She had made it back to the door. She had come as far as she could come. She lay there. In the morning, the Levite, who has apparently slept through the night inside the house, gets up, ready to leave. He opens the door. He sees her. "Get up," he says. "Let's go." She does not answer. She does not move. The woman fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, with her hands on the threshold. And whether she was already dead when he found her, or whether she died on the journey home, the text leaves deliberately ambiguous. Some ancient readers argued she survived. Modern scholars tend to read the narrative as implying she did not. Either way, by the time the Levite reaches his home in Ephraim, she is dead. And then he does something that will shatter Israel. 12 pieces. He takes a knife. He takes the body of his concubine, this woman who had run away from him, whom he had retrieved, whom he had handed to a mob, and he cuts her into 12 pieces. And he sends one piece to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 pieces, 12 tribes. One body distributed across the geography of an entire nation. This act is shocking on multiple levels. In the ancient Near Eastern world, cutting a body and distributing its parts was a recognized method of summoning military forces. There are ancient Mari texts from Mesopotamia, dating to approximately 1800 BCE, that describe cutting animals into pieces as part of treaty oaths, the symbolic message being, this is what will happen to those who break the covenant. 1,000 years later, Saul will do something similar in 1 Samuel 11, cutting his oxen and sending the pieces to the tribes of Israel to rally them for battle. The Levite is using the body of his concubine as a military instrument. He is summoning Israel to war. The messengers who carry the pieces presumably also carry a message, because when the tribes receive the pieces, they gather, all of Israel. From Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, the text tells us, the land was shaken. Literally, the earth trembled. 400,000 armed men assemble at Mizpah. The Levite stands before this gathering of Israel and tells his story. But notice how he tells it. I came to Gibeah in Benjamin with my concubine to spend the night. During the night, the men of Gibeah came after me and surrounded the house, intending to kill me. They raped my concubine, and she died. They came after me. They intended to kill me. She died. The Levite's account centers himself. The victim becomes a supporting character in her own story. His near death becomes the crime. Her actual death becomes a footnote. The assembly of Israel is rallied not by the horror of what was done to a woman, but by the horror of what was almost done to a man. This is the moment where the text, without a word of commentary, reveals the full depth of the corruption it is documenting. The woman who ran away, the woman who was pushed out the door, the woman whose hands were on the threshold. She does not even get to be the subject of her own story. Israel demands justice. The civil war. The assembled tribes send a delegation to the tribe of Benjamin. Their demand is straightforward. Hand over the men of Gibeah who did this. Let justice be done. Benjamin refuses. The reasons are not entirely clear. Perhaps tribal loyalty, perhaps pride, perhaps the Benjaminites did not fully believe the account, or believed it but refused to be dictated to by the other tribes. Whatever the reason, Benjamin mobilizes for war. 26,700 soldiers plus 700 elite left-handed slingers from Gibeah itself, men who could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Against them, 400,000 Israelite soldiers. The odds should have been overwhelming. They were not. Before the first battle, Israel goes to Bethel, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept at this time, and inquires of God, who should lead the attack against Benjamin. God designates Judah as the lead tribe. Israel goes up to battle and is defeated. 22,000 Israelite soldiers fall in the first battle against Benjamin. 22,000 men. The army that outnumbered Benjamin by 15-1 returns in the evening, weeping before the Lord. They go back to ask God, "Shall we fight again?" God says yes. They fight again. Another 18,000 Israelites fall, 40,000 casualties in 2 days, against an army that should have been hopelessly outmatched. This has confounded theologians and military historians alike. Why does God allow this? Why does the side of apparent justice suffer such catastrophic losses? Some interpreters suggest God is testing Israel's resolve, ensuring that when victory comes, no one can attribute it to superior numbers or tactics. Others suggest the text is implying that Israel itself was not pure, that the same moral corruption that produced Gibeah also permeated the nation that stood against it. Perhaps the 400,000 men who gathered in moral outrage were not themselves innocent. Perhaps a nation of people who had spent 3 centuries doing what was right in their own eyes had no standing to act as judges. The third day changes everything. This time Israel uses a strategy. They draw the Benjaminites out of Gibeah by a feigned retreat, a classic ambush tactic. While the main Benjaminite force pursues the fleeing Israelites, a reserve force of 10,000 men circles back and seizes Gibeah. They set the city on fire. When the Benjaminites fighting in the field turn and see the smoke rising from their city, panic breaks. Israel's main force turns and fights. The reserve force pours out of the burning city. Benjamin is caught between them. 25,100 Benjaminite soldiers die that day. The text is precise. Only 600 men escape, fleeing to the rock of Rimmon in the wilderness, where they take shelter. Gibeah is utterly destroyed. Every city of Benjamin is destroyed. Every person, man, woman, child, is put to the sword. Every animal is killed. Every building burned. This is Herem, the complete dedication of something to destruction, the total annihilation that the law prescribed for the enemies of God. Benjamin has become, in the eyes of Israel, something worse than a Canaanite enemy. It has become an abomination from within. And then Israel realizes what it has done. The second catastrophe. The same people who had just annihilated the tribe of Benjamin gathered at Bethel and wept before the Lord. "Why did this happen to Israel?" they cried. "Why should one tribe be missing from Israel today?" 600 men remained, 600 survivors of an entire tribe hiding in the wilderness of Rimmon. And these men had no wives, because Israel had taken an oath at Mizpah before the war that none of them would give their daughters in marriage to Benjamin. Now they faced a crisis they had created themselves. They had nearly wiped out a tribe. They had sworn not to replenish it through normal intermarriage, and they found this unacceptable. The tribe of Benjamin must continue. 12 tribes of Israel must remain 12. So they asked, who from among all the tribes of Israel did not come to the assembly at Mizpah? The answer was Jabesh Gilead. The people of Jabesh Gilead, a settlement east of the Jordan, had not sent any soldiers to the war against Benjamin. The assembly sent 12,000 warriors to Jabesh Gilead with these instructions: "Put to the sword those living there, including the women and children. This is what you are to do. Kill every male and every woman who is not a virgin." They killed the men, they killed the married women, they killed the children. They brought back 400 young women who were virgins and gave them to the surviving Benjaminites at the rock of Rimmon. 400 women, 600 men, 200 short. The elders of Israel struggled with this gap. They couldn't give their own daughters. They had sworn an oath. And then someone remembered Shiloh. Every year there was a festival to the Lord at Shiloh, and the daughters of Shiloh came out to dance in the vineyards. The elders' instruction to the Benjaminite men: "Go hide in the vineyards and watch. When the daughters of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing, rush from the vineyards, and each of you seize a wife from the daughters of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin." Rush from the vineyards, seize a wife. The Hebrew verb here, chataf, means to snatch, to grab, to take by force. Israel's solution to the shortage of wives was to tell the surviving men of Benjamin to ambush and abduct the daughters of Shiloh during a religious festival. And then, in what may be the most cynical passage in the entire book, the elders add this: "When their fathers or brothers complain to us, we will say to them, 'Do us a kindness by helping them, because we did not get wives for them during the war, and you are innocent, since you did not give your daughters to them.'" The technical, legalistic parsing: "We did not give your daughters because they were taken. Therefore you are not guilty of breaking the oath." Everyone is absolved. The legal language is preserved. The women are simply not part of the calculation. The Benjaminites did as instructed. They ambushed the daughters of Shiloh. They took them by force, and they returned to their rebuilt cities and their rebuilt lives. And the book of Judges ends. What just happened? Let's stand back from this story for a moment, because the full weight of what we've just read can be difficult to absorb. A woman ran away from her husband. She was retrieved. She was pushed out a door. She was gang raped all night. She died. Her body was cut into 12 pieces. Her death triggered a civil war that killed more than 65,000 people. The reconstruction after the war involved the massacre of an entire settlement, except its virgin daughters. It involved the mass abduction of women from a religious festival. And the book of Judges ends without a single word of condemnation for any of it. No voice from heaven, no prophet calling anyone to account, no divine judgment on the Levite who pushed her out the door, or the men who raped her, or the elders who authorized abduction, or any of the many people who made countless decisions that treated women as objects to be transferred, traded, taken, or used. Everyone did as they saw fit. That is the book's conclusion. That is its verdict on these events, not an explanation, an indictment. The narrator is not endorsing what happened. The narrator is documenting the full horror of a world in which moral order has collapsed, a world in which the very people who claim to be God's covenant people are capable of behavior indistinguishable from the worst of what they were meant to stand against. This is not a story about Canaanite evil. This is a story about Israelite evil. The Levite is not a pagan. Gibeah is not Sodom. The men who authorized abduction are not foreign kings. They are the people of the covenant, and they have become exactly what they were supposed to transform. That is the theological point. That is what makes this story so devastating. The external threat is never as dangerous as the internal rot. The unnamed woman. We need to talk about her, because in 3,000 years of interpretation, she has been almost entirely overlooked. The debates have been about the war, about the tribe of Benjamin, about the question of kingship, about the Levite's culpability, about the theological problem of God allowing Israel to lose the first two battles, about whether this passage anticipates the failures of Saul, who was a Benjaminite. She lies on the threshold of almost every page of commentary, and almost every commentary steps over her. Her name is never given, not once. In 3 chapters of text, she is called the concubine or the woman. Once, in what may be the most chilling verse in the passage, she is called the woman who was murdered. That is her closest approach to personhood in the entire narrative. Feminist theologians in the 20th century began to reckon with this absence in ways that earlier interpretive traditions had not. Phyllis Treibel, in her landmark 1984 work, Texts of Terror, named the concubine one of the texts of terror for women in the Hebrew Bible, passages whose violence against women had been systematically neutralized, allegorized, or simply ignored by centuries of male scholarship. Treibel did something radical. She stayed with the concubine. She refused to move on to the theological implications until she had fully registered the horror of what happened to this particular woman. Her hands on the threshold. That detail, her hands were on the threshold, is not incidental. The threshold of a home in the ancient Near East was a charged, symbolic space. It was the boundary between inside and outside, between safety and danger, between the domestic and the wild. There were ancient rituals associated with the threshold. Marriage ceremonies crossed it. Death could not enter through a properly protected threshold. The mezuzah, the doorpost inscription still used in Jewish homes today, marks the threshold as sacred space. She died on the threshold. She made it back to the door, but not through it. She reached the boundary of the place that should have been safety, the place from which she had been ejected, and she could go no further. What does it mean that the Levite opens the door the next morning and finds her there? What does it mean that his first words to her are, "Get up, let's go"? There is a terrible callousness in that command that has always struck readers as revealing something about who this man is. He is not described as horrified. He is not described as weeping. He sees her, speaks, and when she doesn't respond, he loads her onto his donkey and goes home. Some early Jewish commentators suggested she was still alive at this point and died on the journey. This interpretation seems to be motivated in part by a desire to soften the Levite's behavior, to make his "get up, let's go" less of a command to a corpse and more of a desperate appeal to a survivor. But most modern readings take the earlier verse, "There was no answer," as indicating she had already died. He loaded the body of the woman he had pushed out the door onto his donkey, and he took her home. And then he cut her into pieces. The archaeology of Gibeah. Here is where the history becomes strange and fascinating. Gibeah, Tel El-Ful in modern Arabic, sits on a hill about 3 miles north of Jerusalem. Archaeological excavations at the site, first conducted by William Foxwell Albright in 1922 and resumed by Paul Lapp in 1964, revealed something remarkable. The site shows evidence of a massive, sudden destruction in the Iron Age 1 period, roughly 1200 to 1000 BCE. The burned remains, the destruction layer, the sudden abandonment of the settlement, all of it is consistent with the kind of total annihilation described in Judges 20. This is one of those moments where archaeology and text converge in a way that makes the hair stand up. Albright himself, writing about the excavation, noted the correspondence between the destruction layer at Tel El-Ful and the narrative of Judges. The city the text calls Gibeah shows the physical marks of a catastrophic destruction in precisely the period when Judges 19:21 is set. Now this does not prove that the events of Judges 19:21 happened exactly as described. Ancient texts are complex documents with layers of authorship, editing, theological shaping, and narrative elaboration. The story as we have it has almost certainly been told and retold across generations before reaching its final written form. But the archaeology does suggest that something happened at Gibeah, something large enough and violent enough to leave a destruction layer visible 3,000 years later. There is also the question of where Jabesh Gilead was. The site is debated among scholars, but most locate it in the Transjordanian highlands east of the Jordan River in modern-day Jordan. The region had distinct cultural and historical connections with the tribe of Benjamin that predate this story. In 1 Samuel 11, when the Ammonites threatened Jabesh Gilead, Saul, a Benjaminite, is the one who rises to rescue them. The later connection between Saul and Jabesh Gilead makes more sense in light of the Judges narrative. The people of Jabesh Gilead became a kind of satellite community of Benjamin, bound to them by the events described here. And Shiloh, the site of the annual festival where the daughters were abducted, has been extensively excavated at Khirbet Seilun in the Central Highlands. The site shows evidence of a significant cultic center in the Late Bronze and Iron Age Dari periods, consistent with its role in the Judges and early Samuel narratives as the central sanctuary of Israel. Interestingly, Shiloh also shows a massive destruction layer, generally dated to around 1050 BCE, which has been associated by some scholars with the Philistine capture of the Ark of the Covenant, described in 1 Samuel 4. The site that hosted a festival during which Israelite women were abducted was itself later destroyed. The land remembers everything. The question of Saul. There is a political dimension to these chapters that we cannot ignore. Gibeah is not just any Benjaminite city. Gibeah, specifically Tel El-Ful, is later identified as the hometown of Saul, Israel's first king. The man who will become king comes from the city that is the site of the greatest moral catastrophe in the entire book of Judges. This is not an accident. The book of Judges is generally understood to have reached its final form during the Deuteronomistic reform period, most likely during the reign of King Josiah in the late 7th century BCE, or possibly during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. These editors were working with older source materials, but they shaped those materials with theological purpose. And the theological purpose of the final chapters of Judges, the appendices, as scholars call chapters 17 through 21, appears to be a sustained argument for monarchy, not for just any monarchy, for the Davidic monarchy, for the dynasty that came from Judah, not Benjamin. Look at the structure of the final chapters. They tell two stories. First, the story of Micah and the Danites in chapters 17 and 18, which involves theft, idolatry, and the founding of a corrupt sanctuary in the north. Second, the story of the Levites' concubine in chapters 19 through 21, which involves sexual violence, civil war, massacre, and abduction. Both stories are set in Benjamin and involve Levites from Ephraim. Both stories are disasters. Both stories end with the refrain, "In those days, there was no king in Israel." The implication is clear. A king is needed. Order is needed. The moral chaos of the judge period cannot continue. But the book does not say just any king will solve this. The historical context in which these chapters were finalized is one in which the Davidic monarchy, the line from the tribe of Judah, had already been established as the legitimate ruling dynasty. The critique embedded in these chapters is partly a critique of the Benjaminite king who came first, Saul. Saul came from Gibeah. Saul's kingship began promisingly and descended into tragedy. Saul was rejected by God. Saul was replaced by David, and the city that bore Saul's name was the same city that had committed the atrocity that nearly destroyed a tribe. The editors of Judges are, in part, making a case that the problem with the Saul kingship was not merely personal. It was genealogical, geographical, moral. It came from the wrong place. It was rooted in soil soaked with blood. This interpretation should not be allowed to overshadow the story's other dimensions. It is first and foremost a moral narrative, not merely a political one. But the political layer is there. It is part of how this story functioned in ancient Israel's ongoing reckoning with its own history and identity. The theology of silence. Here is perhaps the most theologically significant feature of Judges 19 through 21. God is almost entirely absent. In the rest of Judges, God speaks. God designates judges, God gives strength to Samson, God appears to Gideon. God's presence or absence is the interpretive framework through which events are explained. In these final chapters, God speaks only twice, to designate Judah as the lead tribe before the first battle, and to tell Israel to fight again before the second. God does not speak to stop the rape. God does not intervene to protect the woman. God does not condemn the Levite. God does not prevent the massacre of Jabesh Gilead. God does not stop the abduction at Shiloh. This silence is not accidental. The theological tradition of the Hebrew Bible contains a concept that modern theologians sometimes call the hiddenness of God, or in the Hebrew, hester panim, the hiding of God's face. There are moments in the text when God withdraws, when the divine presence recedes and human beings are left entirely to the consequences of their own choices. Judges 19 through 21 is the fullest expression of hester panim in the entire book of Judges. God has not abandoned Israel. The brief oracular answers to military questions confirm that divine communication is still possible. But God has withdrawn from active intervention in human affairs. The people who do what is right in their own eyes are allowed to do what is right in their own eyes, all the way to its horrifying conclusion. This is not a God who endorses the atrocities. This is a God who has handed a generation over to the full consequences of its own moral corruption. The silence of God in these chapters is itself a form of divine speech. This is what you have become. The great 20th century theologian Karl Barth wrote about the strange work of God, the divine acts that appear to be abandonment but are actually a form of severe mercy, allowing human beings to exhaust their own capacity for self-destruction in order to prepare the soil for something new. Whether one finds that theological framework satisfying or not, it captures something of what Judges 19 through 21 seems to be doing narratively. The horror is allowed to reach its full expression so that the reader, ancient or modern, can see it clearly, without mitigation, without narrative rescue. This is who you are. This is what you have done. Now look at it. Her hands on the threshold. There is a moment in Judges 19 that deserves more attention than it has traditionally received. The morning after the rape, the Levite opens the door. He sees his concubine fallen at the threshold, her hands on the threshold, and he says, "Get up, let's go." She doesn't answer. She doesn't move. And then in verse 28, the Levite put her on his donkey and set out for home. This sequence has been read by some interpreters as evidence that she was still alive, that his words were directed at a living person, a survivor. But the phrase that follows, and the framing of the entire passage, suggests otherwise. The text is recording a man who has just discovered that the woman he handed to a mob has been raped to death, and whose response is to treat the body as cargo for transport. But there's something else in this scene, something that translation sometimes misses. The Hebrew text says she fell at the door of the man's house, where her master was, with her hands on the threshold. The word translated master here, Adon, is the same word used throughout this story for the Levite. He is consistently referred to as her master, never as her husband. This is not incidental. It reflects the legal reality of the concubinage relationship, and more pointedly, it frames the relationship in terms of ownership and power. She crawled back to the house of her master. Her hands were on the threshold of the house of the man who had pushed her out. There is something almost unbearable in that image. She had nowhere else to go. The man who had chosen her, the man she had run away from, the man she had returned with, the man who had, in the end, made the choice that killed her. His house was the only house she had. So she crawled back to it. Phyllis Tribal ends her analysis of this passage with these words: "This woman came with her husband and died with strangers. In losing her, all Israel has lost itself. In losing her, all Israel has lost itself." The woman they called a piece of flesh. Who was she, really? We can speculate. We can read between the lines. We can use what we know about the world she lived in to imagine the contours of a life the text refuses to give us. She was a daughter of Bethlehem in Judah. Bethlehem, the house of bread, the fertile agricultural town in the Judean hills that would later be famous as the birthplace of David and then of Jesus. She came from a family wealthy enough, or connected enough, that a Levite from the hill country of Ephraim had married her. Not as his primary wife, perhaps, but as a recognized legal partner. She had the capacity to make a decision. She ran away. Whatever her reasons, infidelity or injury, anger or fear, she exercised the only form of agency available to her, and she used it. She went home to her father's house in Bethlehem, and she stayed there for 4 months. For 4 months she was in a place she had chosen, with people who received her, and then the man came. We don't know what she felt when he arrived. We don't know if she was glad or afraid or resigned. We don't know if she went back willingly or under social compulsion. Because when your husband travels 40 miles to retrieve you, and your father welcomes him for 5 days, and the entire social structure of the world you live in recognizes his claim on your person, the question of willingness becomes very complicated. She traveled with him. She sat in the public square of Gibeah. She was in the old man's house when the mob surrounded it. And then she was outside, in the dark, with the men of Gibeah. We can't know what she experienced. The text is merciful in that way. It does not linger on the details of her suffering. They raped her and abused her throughout the night, is all it says. All night. And at dawn, they let her go. Let her go. As if she had been temporarily borrowed. She crawled back to the door. She put her hands on the threshold. She died. And the man who would use her death to start a war never learned, or never told, her name. What this means today, ancient texts only survive because each generation found them relevant. The story of the unnamed concubine has survived 3,000 years of copying, editing, translating, and debate. It has survived because, despite everything, people keep returning to it. There is something here that will not be dismissed. We live in a world that still, in countless contexts, discusses violence against women, primarily in terms of its effects on men. Still treats the violation of women as a secondary tragedy when what is primary is the insult to honor, or the disruption of social order, or the political consequences that follow. Still sometimes fails to learn the names of victims while recording in elaborate detail the names of perpetrators and bystanders and political actors. The unnamed woman of Judges 19 is not a unique tragedy. She is a pattern. She is the shape of what happens when a society's moral order has collapsed to the point where the humanity of certain people, women, the vulnerable, the legally unprotected, can simply be subtracted from the moral equation. The book of Judges looked at that world and said, everyone did as they saw fit. And this is what that looks like. It is not a comfortable message. It is not a message that offers easy solutions. There is no hero in this story. There is no rescue. There is no triumph. There is only a woman's hands on a threshold and a question that echoes across 3,000 years. Who is she? What was her name? Why does it matter that we never knew it? It matters because the failure to know her name is the failure the story is documenting. The 12 tribes of Israel heard about her death. 400,000 men marched to avenge the violence done to her. Tens of thousands of soldiers died. Entire cities were burned. Women were massacred and abducted to replenish a tribe. And not one person, not one in 3 chapters of text, says her name. Her name was unknown then. It is unknown now, but her hands were on the threshold. She made it back to the door. She was there. She was there. The legacy of Gibeah. The name Gibeah echoes through the rest of the Hebrew Bible in ways that confirm its status as a watchword for moral catastrophe. The prophet Hosea, writing in the 8th century BCE, 200 years after the events of Judges, and in the final decades before the northern kingdom of Israel fell to Assyria, uses Gibeah repeatedly as shorthand for Israel's fundamental corruption. They have deeply corrupted themselves, as in the days of Gibeah, Hosea 9:9 says, and later, from the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel. Hosea is writing to a generation that is about to lose everything, to be conquered, exiled, scattered, and his diagnosis of what has gone wrong reaches all the way back to the nameless woman in the hill country of Ephraim who crawled back to a door. The days of Gibeah, the days of moral catastrophe, the days when everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and a woman died at a threshold and no one came. The prophet is saying, you have never stopped being that. You have carried Gibeah with you. Every generation since that night has been, in some part, the generation that hands someone out a door. This is the Hebrew prophetic tradition at its most penetrating, the willingness to look at the worst thing that has ever happened and say, "We are still doing this." The catastrophe did not end with the destruction of Gibeah. It was not resolved by the civil war. It was not healed by the replenishment of the tribe of Benjamin. It became a wound in Israel's memory, and a generation of prophets kept pressing on that wound because they knew that the only thing more dangerous than a remembered catastrophe is a forgotten one.
Greetings.
The threshold. I want to end where the story ends. With her. There is a rabbinic tradition found in Midrashic literature, the ancient Jewish interpretive texts that sought to fill in the silences of the Hebrew Bible, that imagined the prayers of the dead as heard in heaven. The Midrash has a way of insisting that those who are silenced in the text are not silent in eternity. I am not making a claim here about the afterlife or the nature of divine justice. I am making a claim about literature and memory and the obligations they create. When a story survives for 3,000 years, it survives because someone kept telling it, because someone in every generation found it worth preserving, worth transmitting, worth reading aloud. The unnamed woman's story survived not because she was named, but because what happened to her was considered important enough to keep. And perhaps that is its own form of terrible justice. The story that would not give her a name could not forget her story. The culture that treated her as an object could not stop telling what was done to her. She haunts the text. She haunts the prophets. She haunts the scholars and theologians and ordinary readers who come to Judges 19 and cannot look away. Her hands were on the threshold. She made it that far. She came back to the door. The question the story asks, the question it has always asked, is whether we will open it, whether we will open the door and see her and say her name. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And a woman's hands were on the threshold, and the door did not open. This is the word of the Lord. This is also the word of the people. And the distance between those two sentences, that distance is where all of us live.